Hello everyone. Tonight we step into mysterious adventures, journeys that begin as ordinary explorations, but end as extraordinary tales. So before you settle in comfortably, go ahead and hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the mysterious. And don't forget to leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from tonight. It's always fascinating to see us connecting from all across the world. Now, dim the lights, let the room grow quiet, and join me as we begin tonight's strange and haunting journey. The Franklin expedition of 1845 is remembered as one of the most infamous journeys in the history of exploration, ultimately ending in disappearance and grisly revelations about the fate of its crew. Yet it was not Franklin's first foray into the Arctic. 2 decades earlier, he had already embarked on several voyages into the uncharted northern reaches of North America, one of which gained notoriety for entirely different reasons. And perhaps it was even more disturbing, for there is something far more chilling about a story told by a survivor than one pieced together from archaeological discoveries. This was Franklin's Coppermine expedition, and, as always, viewer discretion is advised. At the dawn of the 19th century, as Europe emerged from the long shadow of the Napoleonic Wars, the Royal Navy suddenly found itself in need of a new purpose. The wars had redrawn borders and reshaped empires, but with peace restored, Britain's mighty fleet and its powerful officers now had little to do. It was in this moment of transition that Sir John Barrow, the second Secretary of the Admiralty, turned his sights toward one of the most alluring prizes of exploration, the Northwest Passage. This fabled route was rumored to cut across the frozen seas of the Arctic, connecting Europe with East Asia and promising a faster, more efficient path for global trade. The very idea of such a northern corridor had captivated European powers for centuries, and though unconfirmed, fragments of evidence hinted at its possibility. Whalers returning from the Bering Strait reported capturing whales bearing scars from harpoons launched on opposite sides of the world, a tantalizing clue that the Arctic Ocean and the Atlantic might indeed be connected. Still, the maze of islands and the frozen waters off northern Canada remained largely unmapped. Much of what Europeans knew came from scattered sightings and the knowledge of indigenous peoples. Vast stretches of coastline had never been laid eyes upon by Europeans at all. For Barrow, the Northwest Passage promised not only economic gain but also geopolitical dominance. If Britain could chart the route, it would secure a maritime shortcut to Asia's wealth and reinforce its standing as a global empire. In 1818, the Admiralty launched its first Arctic voyage under Barrow's new direction, Encana, but the results proved disappointing. Captain John Ross sailed into Lancaster Sound, ISCC, the very inlet thought to be the gateway to the Northwest Passage, only to turn back prematurely, mistaking it for a dead-end bay. At the same time, another expedition under David Buchan attempted a direct assault on the pole itself, returning only with tales of impassable ice north of Spitsbergen, Norway. These failures did not deter Barrow. Instead, they hardened his resolve. The following year, 2 fresh expeditions were planned. The first, led by William Edward Parry, would once again press into Lancaster Sound. The second would attempt an overland route, traveling down the Coppermine River to the Arctic coast. The overland party's mission was to chart previously unknown stretches of the northern shoreline, ideally linking up with Parry's ships if fortune allowed. To lead such an ambitious undertaking, Barrow appointed John Franklin, then a promising naval lieutenant who had served under Buchan during the failed voyage of 1818. You may already recognize Franklin's name from his later, ill-fated expedition, but at this stage, he was still largely untested in the extreme conditions of the Arctic. What he did have, however, was a reputation for calmness and iron resolve, qualities that would be sorely tested. His orders were sweeping: to map the northern coast of an entire continent and to record any scientific or geographic mysteries along the way. If successful, Franklin's expedition could prove the Northwest Passage to be a viable route. If not, it might relegate the passage to the realm of myth. Unlike Parry's or Ross's seaborne missions, Franklin's journey would rely primarily on overland travel across some of the harshest, least known terrain in North America. The Admiralty's instructions granted Franklin wide discretion, but his main objective was clear: chart the Arctic coast beginning at the mouth of the Coppermine River, with the ideal goal of reaching Repulse Bay, where he might rendezvous with Perry's fleet. If conditions made that impossible, he was to turn westward, exploring the coastline between the Coppermine and the Mackenzie rivers. In addition to exploration, the party was tasked with collecting meteorological data, studying the aurora's magnetic effects, and documenting plants, animals, and the indigenous communities they encountered. In short, the expedition was expected to blend geography with science, an enormous challenge given the meager budget provided. Because resources were scarce, Franklin's men would depend heavily on two rival fur trading companies, the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, K, for food, transport, and skilled labor. This reliance would set the stage for a journey as fraught with politics as it was with peril. The Métis voyageurs, ASNT, renowned for their endurance and intimate knowledge of the land, were hired on as paddlers and laborers, while the Yellowknives, the indigenous people of the region, served as guides and hunters. To lead the party, Franklin carefully assembled a small but elite cadre of 4 key men. The first was Dr. John Richardson, a naturalist and second-in-command, tasked with recording the wildlife and environmental conditions of the Arctic. Alongside him were Robert Hood and George Back, 2 young naval officers charged with mapping, sketching, and chronicling the journey in their journals. Finally, there was John Hepburn, an experienced sailor whose ingenuity and good humor helped sustain morale during the harshest of days. Together with the Métis voyageurs and their indigenous guides, they formed the backbone of Franklin's expedition. With plans finalized, preparations began in the early months of 1819, but difficulties arose almost immediately. The budget was meager, forcing Franklin to accept whatever supplies the fur companies were willing to part with, often outdated equipment and inadequate provisions. The fierce rivalry between the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company made matters worse. Neither side was eager to see Franklin succeed, and both delivered less than what had been promised. At last, on May 23, 1819, the party sailed from Gravesend, England aboard a Hudson's Bay Company supply ship. The voyage began on a somewhat comical note. When they paused along the Norfolk coast, George Back stepped ashore briefly, only to find himself stranded when the ship, aided by a sudden favorable wind, pulled away without him. By sheer luck and determination, Back chased the vessel overland by horse and ferry, rejoining his comrades at Orkney, Scotland. This minor mishap soon gave way to far more serious trials once they reached Canadian soil. From there lay a grueling trek of more than 1,700 miles, stretching from York Factory on Hudson Bay to Great Slave Lake in the Northwest Territories. Following established fur trade routes by canoe and overland portage, the men stopped at trading posts along the way. But the interior journey proved brutally unforgiving. Food was chronically short, and promised resupplies from the fur companies often never arrived. At times, Franklin was forced to abandon vital equipment on the assumption that replacements would be forwarded later, supplies that never came. Meanwhile, tension grew between the Métis voyageurs and the indigenous guides, the relentless hardships stoking doubts about the expedition's chances of success. By the winter of 1819, when Franklin and his men reached Cumberland House in present-day Saskatchewan, it was already clear that this journey would test human endurance as much as geographic discovery. The small trading post, little more than a rough log cabin crowded with about 30 Hudson's Bay men, offered scant shelter from the punishing cold of the Canadian prairie winter. Provisions were scarce, and hunting yielded little. Richardson and Hood filled their journals with descriptions of suffering, noting especially the unprecedented severity of the cold. In the early months of 1820, Franklin, Back, and Hepburn set out for Fort Chipewyan in present-day Alberta to secure additional supplies and manpower. That journey proved no less merciless. They trudged through dense pine forests and across frozen lakes, enduring temperatures so severe that tea froze solid the moment it was poured. Even the mercury in their thermometers congealed. Without tents, they burrowed into snowdrifts for shelter. When they finally staggered into Fort Chipewyan at the end of March, the men were exhausted, painfully aware that only half the journey lay behind them. Franklin's optimism quickly faltered against reality. The fur companies, preoccupied with their rivalry, gave little meaningful support. Skilled voyageurs, essential for navigation and transport, either refused to risk their lives or were tied up in the ongoing fur trade war. In the end, Franklin managed to recruit only 16 men, far fewer than expected, and hardly adequate in experience or stamina. The expedition's future had grown increasingly uncertain. By spring, Richardson and Hood rejoined the advance party, and the group pressed on to Fort Providence, a remote post on the northern shore of Great Slave Lake. There, Franklin met Akaicho, the influential chief of the Yellowknives First Nation. Akaicho agreed to serve as guide and hunter, though not without frank skepticism. He questioned the very value of the Northwest Passage, pointing out that Europeans had sought it in vain for centuries. If it were truly so important, he argued, surely it would have been found by now. Still, despite his doubts, Akaicho agreed to help, on conditions. He demanded firearms, ammunition, and tobacco for his people, along with forgiveness of debts owed to the Northwest Company. Franklin, desperate for guidance, readily consented. Though wary at first, he would soon find Akaicho's support invaluable. In July of 1820, the expedition departed Fort Providence to establish a winter base near their ultimate objective, the mouth of the Coppermine River. Traveling with Akaicho's band, Franklin was led to a site near the Snare River, where they began constructing what became known as Fort Enterprise. The base amounted to little more than a cluster of crude log huts, intended as a supply depot for the final push to the Arctic coast. Yet from the outset, like so much of Franklin's journey, Fort Enterprise was plagued by hunger and failing morale. Though Akaicho promised to store dried meat for the coming winter, Franklin's party knew survival would hinge on hunting, an unreliable and often barren prospect. The winter of 1820 to 1821 at Fort Enterprise proved to be among the most punishing chapters of the expedition. Provisions dwindled with alarming speed, and Akaicho's hunters, despite their best efforts, found little game. Starvation loomed as a constant threat. Leadership under Franklin came under severe strain as tension and despair spread among the men, each day a reminder that this was not simply a voyage of discovery but a brutal test of endurance against the Arctic itself. A mutiny nearly broke out, checked only when Franklin threatened harsh punishment for any act of disobedience. As the long winter dragged on, the burden of survival steadily eroded the cohesion of the party. Personal conflicts between officers and men grew bitter, while Franklin's optimism at times seemed almost delusional against the bleak reality they faced. And yet, against all odds, the expedition endured, clinging to the faint hope that they might at last reach the Arctic coast and complete their mission. What they did not realize was that the hardships at Fort Enterprise had been only a prelude. The spring of 1821 brought a brief renewal of strength. Having survived the merciless winter, Franklin pressed northward. Though provisions were scarce and tensions unresolved, on June 4, 1821, he and his men departed for the mouth of the Coppermine River, intent on following the coast eastward. The party carried 3 canoes and rations for only 2 weeks, trusting that promised caches along the route would sustain them, but the progress was painfully slow. Canoes splintered on hidden rocks, gales drove them back, and hunting yielded almost nothing. Dissatisfaction mounted, and Franklin grew disillusioned with his Yellowknife guides, who seemed far less familiar with the terrain than expected, shaking the men's confidence. Even so, on July 14th, they reached the Arctic Circle. It was a milestone both proud and bitter. A desolate coast swept by unrelenting winds, choked with drifting ice, offering no real hope of food or shelter. Attempts to trade with nearby Inuit collapsed when terrified villagers abandoned their camps, leaving behind only scraps, rotting salmon, dried birds, and a few dead rodents, scarcely enough to sustain 25 starving men. Yet from the Coppermine's mouth, Franklin insisted on pressing eastward, determined to chart as much shoreline as possible. By August 22nd, they had mapped roughly 675 miles of coast, naming their final point of advance Point Turnagain, a marker of their reluctant decision to turn back. Their canoes were beyond repair, the weather worsening, and provisions nearly gone. With heavy hearts, they prepared for the ordeal of the return. Rather than retrace their path along the coast, Franklin chose to strike inland across an unknown wilderness ominously named the Barren Lands. It was a desperate gamble. Without seaworthy craft, and with winter closing in, they had little choice. The men set out on foot, carrying what little food remained. Sharp stones shredded their worn boots, leaving feet raw and bleeding, while the cold deepened daily. Hunger tightened its grip with an unprecedented ferocity, forcing them to eat lichens, putrid carcasses, even boiled strips of leather torn from their boots. Disobedience flared again. One man destroyed fishing nets. Another sabotaged a canoe in open defiance. Still, the party staggered on, driven only by the fragile hope of reaching Fort Enterprise, where food and shelter supposedly awaited. Their march across the barren lands became a desperate race against time as early winter froze rivers and buried the plains in snow. On September 26th, they reached a broad river, likely the copper mine, only to despair when they found it impassable without boats. Franklin estimated Fort Enterprise lay no more than 40 miles beyond. In desperation, Richardson attempted to swim across, but collapsed in the frigid current and nearly drowned. At that moment, one man, overcome by hopelessness, fled into the wilderness and was never seen again. The survivors hastily built a makeshift craft of willow branches and canvas, ferrying themselves over piecemeal. But the delay proved costly. Within 2 days, several men collapsed, too weak to continue. 2 were left behind where they fell, while Hood and Richardson hovered near death. Franklin split the group. Back and 3 voyageurs were ordered to push ahead to Fort Enterprise, secure supplies, and return. Hood and Richardson, unable to walk, remained behind with Hepburn to await relief. Franklin pressed onward with the rest, only for 4 men to desert within hours, straggling back toward Richardson's camp. Strangely, of those 4, only one, Michel, ever truly returned. Back's advance party reached Fort Enterprise on October 10th, only to discover it abandoned. The promised supplies from Akaicho had never arrived, leaving them in utter despair. With no choice, they left a note for Franklin and struck out toward Fort Providence in search of aid. 2 days later, on October 12th, Franklin's remaining party staggered into Fort Enterprise, clinging to the faint hope that Back had succeeded. By then, starvation had consumed them completely. Gaunt and frail, they tore up the fort's wooden floorboards for fuel, boiled discarded deer hides for food, and gnawed on lichens that offered neither nourishment nor comfort. At the smaller camp, Hood, Richardson, and Hepburn endured Michel's increasingly disturbing behavior. Repeatedly, he left, claiming to hunt, always returning with meat. At first, it seemed salvation, but suspicions grew. Michel refused further hunts, hoarded the meat, and gave contradictory explanations. Sometimes it was hare, other times wolf. Richardson and Hepburn began to fear that the flesh came from the missing men who had vanished with him. Tragedy struck on October 20th, when Hood was found dead, a bullet lodged in the back of his head. Michel insisted it had been an accident while cleaning his musket, but his aggression and manner suggested otherwise. For 3 days, Richardson and Hepburn lived in terror, until Michel departed to gather lichens. Richardson seized the moment, loaded his pistol, confronted Michel on his return, and shot him dead. With no other choice, Richardson and Hepburn dragged themselves to Fort Enterprise, arriving on October 29th. The scene there was no less grim. Back's relief had not returned, and the survivors were too weak to hunt. On November 1st, 2 more men succumbed to starvation. Hepburn, one of the few still able to move, showed signs of severe swelling from protein deficiency. Hope had nearly evaporated, November 7th, until November 7th, when 3 of Akaicho's men finally arrived. They brought provisions, and in the days that followed, continued supplying fish, slowly restoring strength to the emaciated survivors. Recovery was slow but steady, and by mid-November, the party abandoned Fort Enterprise for the last time. On December 11th, they reached Fort Providence, bringing the nightmare to an end. The aftermath of the Coppermine expedition was a complicated mixture of condemnation and reluctant admiration. The human cost was staggering, and the achievements meager, casting a long shadow over its legacy. Franklin and his companions, exhausted and scarred, returned to York Factory in the summer of 1822. Their arrival was met with cool detachment by company officials, weary of supporting a venture they deemed ill-prepared and doomed from the start. George Simpson, a leading figure in the Hudson's Bay Company, was especially scathing. He criticized Franklin's physical limitations, saying he required steady food and rest, unable to march more than 8 miles in a day. He blamed Franklin's rigid insistence on his objectives for prolonging the men's suffering, arguing that a more seasoned leader would have altered course or abandoned the mission far earlier. When Franklin and his fellows returned to England in October of 1822, the public mood was entirely different. Franklin was hailed as a hero, celebrated for his iron will in the face of extraordinary adversity. The Admiralty promoted him to captain, and he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society. His published account of the expedition, released in 1823, quickly became a bestseller, cementing his reputation as the man who ate his boots, a grim allusion to the desperate measures of survival he and his men had endured. And to be fair, despite the suffering, the Coppermine expedition did achieve significant results. It charted hundreds of miles of Arctic coast, provided valuable geographic and scientific data, and, above all, left behind a story so harrowing it fired the imagination of later explorers. Among them was Roald Amundsen, who admitted that Franklin's writings inspired his own polar ambitions. Franklin himself returned to the Arctic in 1825, this time far better prepared, achieving far greater success. He was once again joined by Richardson and Back, mapping even more of the North American coastline. Later he served as Lieutenant Governor of Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania, before embarking on the fateful expedition of 1845. Neither he nor any of his crew would ever return. Denali, at 20,310 feet, 26,190 meters, it is the highest peak in North America. Measured against Earth's other great summits, Denali can seem, at first glance, less imposing. But its remoteness, brutal weather, high latitude, and the sheer vertical distance that must be climbed combine to make it a legendary ordeal. For those reasons, summit success rates on Denali are often lower than on Everest, the world's tallest mountain. And of course, a mountain with such a reputation carries a tragedy to match it, the Denali disaster of 1967. By absolute elevation alone, Denali does not stand out. Any one of the 14 peaks over 8,000 meters towers above it by nearly a quarter. Aconcagua in South America is higher, and Asia holds many more summits that receive less attention only because they are overshadowed by the region's giants. But raw height does not tell the whole story. Summit elevation can be deceiving. It is just one factor in a mountain's difficulty. Crucially, that number is measured from sea level, not from the surrounding terrain. A peak that rises only 5,000 feet above a 10,000-foot plateau can look unimpressive in profile. There is, therefore, another way to measure a mountain's true bulk, from its base to its summit. Measure the mountain itself, not the land it stands upon. By that metric, the vertical distance a climber must actually gain, Denali is the tallest of them all, which means that although Denali reaches only about 20,000 feet compared to Everest's 29,032 feet, the climb on Denali can, in practice, be greater. Everest's primary base sits around 17,000 feet, with the route rising from there to 29,032. Denali's foothills begin near 2,000 feet above sea level, RQ 2000b, and then the mountain blasts upward for more than 20,000 feet. Depending on where you start, a climber gains roughly 2.5 miles of vertical to stand atop Everest, but 3.5 miles to reach Denali's summit. Put another way, were Denali set upon the same high plateau as Everest, it would stand nearly 5,000 feet higher. And astonishingly, that is only part of what makes Denali such a singular challenge. In 1966, at 24 years old, Joe Wilcox had already logged more than 50 ascents of peaks over 10,000 feet across the United States. With that resume at such a young age, he began to imagine his next big climb. That year, Joe was working as a sawyer on several coastal islands near Alaska's Panhandle. Inevitably, his gaze turned north, toward the continent's most commanding mountain. The idea grew until he committed, and he started recruiting for a Denali attempt. At the time, the peak was still widely known as McKinley, later restored to its original name, Denali, used by indigenous Alaskans for hundreds of years. Joe pressed on, first enlisting a few familiar climbers, Jerry Clark and Mark McLaughlin. Jerry, older and better connected in the mountaineering community, took on the task of finding additional teammates. While Jerry handled recruiting, Joe focused on logistics. He set a per-climber cost of $300, roughly $2,000 in today's money, to cover food, equipment, and transportation from Seattle to Alaska. Joe and Jerry circulated a detailed prospectus to more than a dozen potential climbers. It included a day-by-day schedule, training recommendations, and reference material on avalanche hazards and glacier travel. In the end, 6 accepted, bringing the total to 9, counting the original 3. They then filed an application with the Alaska office of the U.S. National Park Service, a mandatory step for anyone attempting the peak. Here came the expedition's first stumble. In reviewing the roster, rangers learned that while the team had solid basic skills, none had experience above 15,000 feet. On Denali, roughly 1/4 of the mountain rises above that altitude, HA, meaning the party was wholly untested against acute mountain sickness. Rangers suggested they coordinate with a separate Colorado team planning a climb at the same time. Joe and the Colorado leader spoke briefly and agreed to cooperate while maintaining separate teams on the mountain. Even so, the Park Service hesitated to approve the permit. Then an opening, whether good fortune or bad, appeared. A Colorado climber was injured in a car crash, suffering a broken arm, leaving that team below the minimum of 4. Rather than abandon years of planning and no small expense, the Colorado group formally merged with Joe's. With those conditions, the Park Service granted approval, ESE, subject to several requirements. The combined team had to carry a radio. More experienced members were to supervise those with less experience, and Joe himself was to train his squad on Mount Rainier prior to Denali, specifically practicing crevasse rescue techniques essential for glacier travel. If they met those conditions, they would be allowed onto Denali. A few weeks later, in late June, the team arrived in Alaska with full kits and high hopes. Their chosen line would come from the north, across the Muldrow Glacier, then up Karstens Ridge. Today, the most common route up Denali comes from the southwest, via the West Buttress, with climbers flown onto the Kahiltna Glacier to begin their ascent. But in that era, the Karstens Ridge route was more frequently used, KB, and significantly cheaper, since it avoided the cost of an airdrop. The trade-off was remoteness. From the end of the nearest road, the climbers had to march 3 full days across mosquito-thick tundra before establishing their first camp at McGonigal Pass, just short of the Muldrow Glacier. On June 22nd, the climb officially began. Another factor that sets Denali apart is its sheer physical demand. Among the world's 7 summits, including Everest, Denali is widely regarded as the most grueling in terms of endurance. Everest carries its infamous death zone above 8,000 meters, where supplemental oxygen is essential. Denali has no such altitude, but is often considered the harsher test of stamina. Part of the reason is the greater vertical gain required, meaning longer, steeper climbs. But the primary factor is isolation. Alaska is sparsely populated, and there is virtually no support for climbers on the mountain. By contrast, Everest, though in the remote Himalayas, lies between the 2 most populous nations on Earth, and benefits from an entire industry of Sherpas carrying countless loads up and down its slopes, providing invaluable support. Denali offers no such assistance. On Denali, every pound must be carried by the climbers themselves. From the start, each man shouldered about 70 pounds on his back and dragged another 150 pounds on a sled. All this while covering long distances and steadily climbing higher. In a typical day on Denali, a team might travel as much as 5.5 miles, gaining nearly 1,000 feet of elevation, all under crushing loads. To be sure, as camps were established and food consumed, those loads grew lighter. But the essential hardship remained. The energy expended on Denali is unmatched almost anywhere else, and the hazards were constant: glacier crossings, yawning crevasses, and deep snow. At the end of each exhausting day, the work was not done. The men had to carve and shovel snow, cut blocks, and pitch their tents, a daily rhythm of labor. For weeks they marched on the moving ice of the Muldrow Glacier, ever wary that a single misstep into a hidden crevasse could end the expedition instantly. They established Camp 2 along the lower icefall, then Camp 3 near the Great Icefall in early July, nearly 2 weeks after leaving McGonigal Pass. Soon after came Camp 4, beneath the Harper Icefall at roughly 12,000 feet, set on July 4th. This icefall is part of the Greater Harper Glacier, which feeds the Muldrow near the mountain's crown, a vast river of ice creeping downslope under its own crushing weight. The icefall was so steep and dangerous that the climbers had to detour up Karstens Ridge rather than attempt a direct ascent. After this diversion, they established Camp 5 on the ridge at 15,000 feet on July 13th, almost a full month into the expedition. Only one more camp stood between them and the summit. By then, altitude sickness had begun to set in, but the symptoms were mild, and the plan remained intact. That same day, while resting, they received a radio forecast warning of a major storm expected around July 16th or 17th. But before then, conditions were predicted to be nearly perfect. After discussion, Joe proposed a push, reach the summit before the storm arrived. If they departed immediately, they could reach high camp, climb to the summit the next day, and descend ahead of the weather with even a day to spare. After further deliberation, they provisioned for 5 days, then established an intermediate Camp 6 at 16,500 feet, both to spend a night and to help their bodies adjust. By evening, they were there, pitched in for the night. The following morning, for reasons not entirely clear, perhaps the declining health of some less experienced members, the party split. 8 men pressed ahead to high camp, Camp 7, while 4 remained at Camp 6 to rest and organize supplies. By 7 o'clock that evening, July 14th, the 8-man group had carved out high camp at 18,000 feet. Everything still followed the plan. If the weather held, within 24 hours they would stand atop the continent's highest point. The next day, the team split again. Only the 4 strongest set out around midday: Joe Wilcox, one of his men, and 2 climbers from the Colorado contingent. The 4 remaining at high camp waited for the last 4 from Camp 6 to join them. That day, conditions were superb: light winds, clear skies, temperatures only a few degrees below freezing. The summit team moved quickly, averaging 500 vertical feet per hour, stopping only briefly to rest and eat. At 6:30 p.m., they crossed the final knife-edge ridge and stepped onto the icy crown of North America. At that moment, perhaps only 200 others on Earth could claim the same. From that tiny perch, they looked out across thousands of miles with nothing higher in any direction. They lingered for nearly 90 minutes, circling the summit, chatting on the radio, even firing flares in celebration. At last, they began their descent at 8 o'clock. Being so far north, the sun would not truly set until near midnight, so they had ample light. 2 hours later, they were safely back at high camp. Almost simultaneously, the remaining 4 from Camp 6 arrived. All 12 members were now gathered at 18,000 feet. Spirits were high. The plan was for the remaining 8 to make their summit bid on July 16th. But when they awoke that morning, the wind had risen, gusting to 70 miles per hour. Instead of climbing, they huddled in their tents, waiting for the storm to break. Their hard-won confidence from the previous day evaporated as they fought to cook meals and dig out snow piling against their shelters. With only 2 stoves for 12 men, some chose to go without food rather than venture out into the gale. Others, racked by altitude sickness, could hardly keep food down anyway. Morale sagged. Some of the less seasoned climbers began to talk of abandoning the summit and simply waiting for a break to retreat. But fortune shifted again. The following morning, they awoke not to howling winds, but silence. After eating and conferring, 7 of the 8 remaining climbers declared they would make the summit attempt after all. One, too weak, Anshul, would descend with the 4 who had already stood atop Denali days earlier. Around midday, this group of 5 gathered their gear, left high camp, and started down toward Camp 6. On their way down, the departing climbers occasionally glanced back and could still see movement in the tents as late as 2 o'clock in the afternoon, far later than expected. Starting so late was clearly unwise. Still, the summit group eventually set off, though with only 6 men instead of 7 to 1, at the last moment, deciding he was too exhausted to continue and remained behind at camp. Just hours into their ascent, another storm began to form above them. And this was no ordinary storm. One of the reasons Denali is so brutally unforgiving is the sheer ferocity of the weather systems that crash against its slopes. The same forces that give Denali its towering, majestic appearance also create some of the harshest conditions on Earth. When Pacific weather systems push northward, instead of being gradually deflected by mountain ranges, they slam directly into Denali's massive bulk. Compounding this, Denali lies close to vast bodies of water and directly in the path of the polar jet stream, which funnels volatile weather straight across its heights. And unlike Everest, Denali sits much farther north, just 3 degrees shy of the Arctic Circle, exposing climbers to extreme swings in temperature. At its worst, a Denali storm ranks among the most savage on the planet. That evening, the camp below received a radio transmission from the summit team. They were still somewhere on the upper slopes but couldn't give their exact position. Dense fog and whiteout conditions had erased every landmark. They planned to bivouac overnight, sleeping out in the open with nothing but sleeping bags, and hoped the weather would ease by morning. But at 11:30 the next morning, an astonishing signal crackled over the radio. They had reached the summit. Conditions were still poor, strong winds, limited visibility, but they had succeeded. The temperature, at -14°C, was warm by Denali standards. Yet there was one glaring problem. Of the 6 who had set out, only 5 remained. A man named John Russell was missing. The others assumed he had turned back to high camp during the storm. In truth, no one knew for certain. The team reported they were preparing to leave the summit and would make contact once they returned to high camp. But shortly after that final transmission, the storm escalated into a cataclysm. A low-pressure system sweeping south collided with a high-pressure mass pushing north, converging directly over the mountain. Winds were estimated at more than 240 kilometers per hour, enough to make progress along the knife-edge ridges virtually impossible. Every trace they left behind was erased instantly. Later, meteorological models suggested that near the summit, gusts may have reached 480 kilometers per hour. These were only estimates, no direct measurements exist. But if accurate, such speeds would surpass every recorded wind on Earth. Even without the records, the storm is remembered as the worst ever encountered by mountaineers. Along with the winds came plunging temperatures, -34°C. In such conditions, their situation was hopeless. They could neither walk nor see. Clinging to the mountain itself became a battle. Some believe they attempted a bivouac less than 1,000 feet from the summit. But in that storm, no bivouac could save them. The storm raged for 4 full days, with only brief pauses. Even the group lower on the mountain, at Camp 5, could do nothing but wait for a break in the weather. On July 18th, the second summit party had set out. By July 19th, the storm's violence confined every man to his tent, struggling simply to stay alive. On July 20th, 3 of the strongest climbers tried to push back up toward high camp in search of their companions, but covering barely half a mile took them nearly 4 hours. Whiteout conditions persisted, and a foot of new snow had buried every track. Forced to retreat, even their own footprints were gone within hours. By midday, the storm eased briefly. From below, they could scan the upper slopes along the route their friends had taken. Nothing. No tents, no climbers, no signals. The realization struck hard. Their comrades were gone. They sent an urgent distress call to the rangers. Soon after, the storm slammed back with full force, and for the next 2 days they remained pinned, crowded into just 2 small tents. By the night of July 21st, conditions grew so dire that all 5 remaining men packed themselves into a single 3-man tent to stay warm. Their clothes were soaked, they could hardly eat or drink, and they endured 2 nights without real rest. On the morning of July 23rd, knowing that hypothermia would soon claim them if they stayed, they seized a fleeting lull in the wind and began descending from 15,000 feet. Halfway across Karstens Ridge, they encountered climbers from the Alaska Mountaineering Club carrying dry supplies and hot drinks. One accompanied them down, while the others pushed upward to search for the missing team. At last, after more than a month on Denali, the survivors staggered into base camp on July 25th. Joe Wilcox himself trekked to Wonder Lake to alert rangers and request helicopters. Exhausted and broken by loss, they were fortunate simply to be alive. The storm did not abate until July 28th. Only then could rescuers ascend high enough to find the shattered remains of high camp. The tents were shredded, gear scattered. The frozen body of one climber still clutched a tent pole. His condition was so poor that identification was impossible. The following day, 2 more bodies were located near the base of Archdeacon's Tower, locked in a posture of resistance against the wind. Their remains, too, were beyond recognition. The others, 4 men, were never found. Buried under snow or blown into inaccessible terrain, they vanished forever. Some even speculate the winds were strong enough to have carried them off the mountain entirely. A year later, in 1968, a humanitarian mission attempted to recover what they could, but by then, virtually nothing remained. Not a trace of the 4 missing men was ever found. To this day, the Denali disaster of 1967 remains the deadliest climbing tragedy in American mountaineering history. As with every great catastrophe, blame followed. Attention focused on the leaders, particularly Joe Wilcox. Survivors published conflicting accounts. fueling debate over who bore responsibility. Over time, fingers were pointed at individuals. Yet later, analysis of weather models revealed the truth. The storm's power was unprecedented. In such conditions, no climber, no matter how skilled or well-equipped, could have survived. Sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. The Mantell UFO incident is one such story. Many have argued that this mystery has long since been solved, but I cannot bring myself to draw that conclusion. Instead, I leave it to you to decide what to believe after hearing the testimony of multiple military personnel who reported seeing unidentified flying objects on January 7, 1948. Sightings made from at least 3 different bases across Kentucky and Ohio. The UFO event of early 1948 quickly gained widespread public attention, appearing in newspapers and magazines in the weeks that followed, largely because it ended in the death of a highly decorated World War II veteran, Captain Thomas F. Mantell. While attempting to intercept an unidentified object at high altitude, Mantell's aircraft was simply not equipped for the conditions he faced. Most likely, he succumbed to hypoxia, losing consciousness as he climbed, before his aircraft fatally crashed. The lingering question has always been why such an experienced pilot would risk his life in such a reckless maneuver, especially when he knew the dangers of flying above 15,000 feet without oxygen. A close friend of Mantell once suggested that the captain must have believed he was pursuing something so important that it outweighed even his own life and the family he left behind. Following Mantell's death, the object first reported over Kentucky was thoroughly investigated by the military. To arrive at a plausible explanation, Air Force investigators concluded that what witnesses saw may have been a combination of Venus shining brightly on the daytime horizon, along with one or more secret military aircraft or high-altitude balloons. This explanation suggested that the brilliance of Venus, paired with the presence of balloons or planes, caused confusion for Captain Mantell and the many ground witnesses. The final object Mantell had been chasing, they claimed, was likely a weather balloon drifting at over 60,000 feet. But while the theory sounded reasonable, even if it required multiple balloons and aircraft to all appear at once, another development quickly complicated matters. Just hours after Mantell's crash, and after the object he pursued had vanished, another luminous craft was sighted from a different military base some 200 miles to the northeast in Ohio. In this second case, the object executed rapid vertical and horizontal movements before disappearing, maneuvers which witnesses insisted bore no resemblance to balloons or to any known aircraft. The same strange craft was later observed again from another base in Ohio, once more performing erratic, impossible motions before vanishing. Despite these incidents occurring on the very same day as Captain Mantell's death, the Air Force's official report did not consider the possibility that the Ohio sightings were related. Yet it is important to note that the second object was confirmed by seasoned Army and Air Force personnel at 2 separate bases, who estimated its speed at well over 500 miles per hour. For your consideration, here are several direct accounts from the military witnesses involved in these 3 events, presented in chronological order. Testimony of Technical Sergeant Quinton A. Blackwell. Technical Sergeant Quinton A. Blackwell was serving as chief operator on duty in the control tower at Godman Field, Kentucky, on the afternoon of January 7, 1948. Up until about 1:15 p.m., everything was normal. At that time, I received a phone call from Sergeant Cook in Colonel Hicks's office, relaying that both the military police at Fort Knox and state police at Elizabethtown were reporting a huge round object, estimated at 250 to 300 feet in diameter, visible over Maysville, in Kentucky. I was instructed to check with Army Flight Service to see if any unusual aircraft were in the area. Flight Service responded that no aircraft were present, logged the report, and requested that our unit commander verify the story. Shortly thereafter, Flight Service relayed additional positions for the object, first over Irvington, Kentucky, then over Owensboro, Kentucky, with the same reported size and shape. Around 1:45 or 1:50 p.m., I observed an object in the southern sky from Godman Field. To confirm, I summoned my flight leader, Lieutenant Orner, to the tower. After he observed the object, he called the operations officer, Captain Carter, through the intercom system. Carter came up immediately, studied the object through binoculars, and then contacted the unit commander, Colonel Hicks, who arrived about 2:20 p.m. and at once saw the object for himself. Between 2:30 and 2:40 p.m., a flight of 4 P-51 Mustangs approached Godman Field from the south on a transit from Marietta, Georgia, to Standiford Field, Kentucky. As they passed overhead, I hailed the flight leader on the B-channel VHF and asked if he had sufficient fuel, and if so, whether he could help identify the object to the south. He agreed, and immediately circled back with 2 other aircraft toward the object. The 4th continued on alone to Standiford Field. The 3-ship formation headed out on a 210-degree bearing, steadily climbing. Around 2:45 p.m., the leader reported visual contact. The object was above and ahead, still climbing. One wingman asked over the radio, "What in the world are we looking for?" Moments later, at 15,000 feet, the leader transmitted, "The object is directly ahead and above me, moving at about half my speed." When pressed to describe it, he replied, "It looks like a metallic object of tremendous size." The leader continued, "I am still climbing. The object is ahead and above, moving at a speed equal to or greater than mine. I am trying to close in for a better look." That final transmission occurred at about 3:15 p.m. Roughly 5 minutes later, the remaining 2 aircraft broke off and returned. Passing back over Godman, one pilot remarked, "It looks like sunlight reflecting on a plane's canopy." Shortly afterward, that same pilot took off again from Standiford to continue the search, climbing to 33,000 feet and ranging nearly 100 miles south, but saw nothing. I left the tower shortly thereafter. The above statement is true and correct to the best of my knowledge. Testimony of Lieutenant Paul I. Orner, Commanding Officer, Unit 7, 33-5. The following is my account of observing unidentified aerial objects from the control tower at Godman Field on January 7, 1948. At about 2:00 p.m. that day, via Staff Sergeant Cook, the tower received reports of an unidentified object moving at tremendous speed near Maysville. Minutes later, this call was canceled by the military police at Fort Knox, acting under orders from the Kentucky State Police. Immediately after, however, several reports from Army Flight Service indicated that the same object had been seen over Irvington and Owensboro, Kentucky. At the same time, Technical Sergeant Blackwell, on duty in the tower, also reported visual contact. I was in the commanding officer's office reviewing the Fort Knox call when it was canceled. I then returned to the tower to see for myself the object they had spotted. There I immediately observed a small white object low in the southwest sky. The object appeared stationary. I could not determine whether it was self-luminous or reflecting light. Through binoculars, it resembled a parachute canopy with sunlight on the silk, yet it also emitted a faint reddish glow around its lower edge. Command staff were immediately summoned, including the commanding officer, the operations officer, the S2 intelligence officer, and the executive officer. Minutes later, 4 P-51 Mustangs passed overhead from the south. I instructed Sergeant Blackwell to contact their leader and ask whether he could see the object. The reply was negative. I suggested the operations officer ask if they had sufficient fuel to pursue the object. The leader answered in the affirmative. 1 P-51 was cleared to break formation and continue to Standiford, where it landed a few minutes later as scheduled. The leader and 2 others flew on a 210-degree course. Within 5 minutes, the leader reported sighting the object at high altitude, moving at half his speed, bearing 12 o'clock. Moments later, he added that the object was now matching his speed, and he was closing to get a better look. This was the last message received from him. Soon afterward, a wingman reported that the leader had vanished. According to testimony from the formation, the leader had been higher and farther ahead until about 3:15 to 3:30 p.m. when he disappeared. The wingman stated that they were forced to return to Standiford Field due to low fuel, arriving between 3:23 and 3:30 p.m. Based on their transmissions, the leader was estimated to be at between 18 and 20,000 feet, while the others were around 15,000 feet, spread in a loose formation. When he disappeared, all others returned to Standiford. One wingman refueled, took on oxygen, and made a second flight along the same 210-degree heading, ranging about 100 miles south of Godman Field, climbing to 33,000 feet. He saw nothing. By 4:45 p.m., when that pilot reported no contact, I left the tower. At about 5:35 p.m. Central Standard Time, I returned to the tower and saw a bright light, distinct from any star, at about a 240-degree bearing and 8 degrees above the horizon. It appeared circular, with a darker spot in its center, and moved northward, before vanishing at the horizon around 250 degrees. Notably, the object remained visible through ground haze when no stars could be seen, and it disappeared only as it dropped below the horizon, like the setting sun or moon. This object was tracked through a meteorological telescope from atop the hangar. Testimony of Captain James F. Dusler, Jr. At approximately 2:20 p.m. on January 7, 1948, I accompanied Lieutenant Colonel E.G. Wood to the Godman Field Control Tower to observe an object hovering high in the southern sky. Shortly after our arrival, Colonel Guy F. Hicks, the commanding officer, was summoned to the tower. It was at this time that I first observed the silvery object. Roughly 5 minutes after Colonel Hicks arrived, a formation of 4 P-51 Mustangs passed over Godman. One of the officers in the tower directed the radio operator to contact the flight and ask their leader if he had sufficient fuel to investigate the object. The leader, Captain Thomas F. Mantell, replied that he did and requested coordinates. At that point, one member of the flight advised that he needed to break off and land. The pilot was overheard requesting landing instructions from Standiford Field at Louisville. Meanwhile, the remaining 3 P-51 seconds continued climbing in the direction indicated by the tower toward the object, which still appeared stationary. The tower then instructed the flight leader to alter his heading 5 degrees to the left. He acknowledged the correction and reported being at 7,500 feet and still climbing. Moments later, one member of the flight asked over the radio, "What in the world are we flying toward?" Within minutes, the leader reported seeing an object at 12 o'clock high. When asked for a description, he said it was bright and continued to climb higher than his aircraft. When asked about speed, he estimated it was moving at about half his own speed, roughly 180 miles per hour. Those of us in the tower could no longer see the formation, but we could still see the object. Soon after that final exchange, the leader reported he was at 15,000 feet and continuing to climb in pursuit, estimating the object was now traveling at a speed equal to his own. At that point, one of his wingmen urged him to level off, but no reply was received. Testimony of Captain Kerry W. Carter, United States Air Force. The undersigned was on duty as operations officer at Godman Field on January 7, 1948. At approximately 2:07 p.m., I received a call from Lieutenant Orner, commanding officer of the AACS detachment, advising that the control tower had sighted an unidentified object and requesting my presence. Lieutenant Orner pointed out the object in the southwest sky, plainly visible to the naked eye. It was round, white, and brighter than the clouds, remaining visible even when partially obscured. Through binoculars, I observed it for about 3 to 4 minutes, then telephoned Colonel Hicks's office to report its presence. Lieutenant Colonel Wood and Captain Dusler arrived at the tower immediately, followed shortly by Colonel Hicks. At this time, a flight of 4 P-51 seconds was spotted approaching from the south. I instructed Sergeant Blackwell, on duty in the tower, to contact the aircraft and ask if they could attempt to identify the object. The pilots responded that they had sufficient fuel to investigate. One aircraft continued on to Standiford, while the other 3 were directed to fly on a 230-degree heading. One of them reported seeing the object at 12 o'clock high and climbing toward it. A moment later, one pilot radioed, "This is 15,000 feet, let's level off." At that point, the aircraft in visual contact estimated the object's speed at about 180 miles per hour. Seconds later, he reported that the object was climbing and moving ahead at a speed equal to his own. He added that he would climb to 20,000 feet, and if unable to close further, would break off the chase. That was the final radio contact I heard. It was not possible to determine with certainty which pilot was speaking. Later, we learned that one aircraft had landed at Standiford to refuel and take on oxygen before resuming the search. Meanwhile, I relayed the description and location of the object to flight service while the aircraft continued their pursuit. Testimony of Colonel Guy F. Hicks, commanding officer. At approximately 1 o'clock on January 7, 1948, my office received a call from the Kentucky State Police reporting an aerial object near Elizabethtown. About 10 minutes later, a second report came in from Maysville. A third call soon followed from Lexington, Kentucky. All of these towns lie to the south of Godman Field. We immediately instructed the tower to keep a careful watch for unidentified objects. At 2:45 p.m., the tower reported that an object had been sighted on a bearing of roughly 215 degrees. I went to the tower and observed it until 3:50 p.m., when it disappeared behind cloud cover. The object was plainly visible to the naked eye, appearing about 1/4 the size of a full moon, white in color. Through 8-power binoculars, I could discern a reddish border along the bottom, and at other times a reddish tinge along the top. It remained stationary in the sky for about an hour and a half. By the time I arrived, Sergeant Quentin A. Blackwell had already contacted 3 P-51 Mustangs in the area, asking if they had sufficient fuel to investigate. As I watched, the planes were still in sight of the tower, flying on a heading of 215 degrees. I heard one pilot report that he had the object directly ahead and estimated its speed at about 180 miles per hour. He further described it as extremely large and brilliantly luminous. A few hours after Captain Mantell's aircraft went down near the Kentucky-Tennessee border, while authorities were still searching for scattered wreckage and opening an investigation, another unidentified aerial object appeared, nearly 200 miles to the northeast, near Lockbourne Air Force Base in Ohio. Air Force investigators would later conclude that the object Mantell pursued was most likely the planet Venus, shining brightly near the horizon, perhaps combined with one or more weather balloons or high-altitude aircraft. Any sudden apparent motion, particularly of the balloon thought to have been Mantell's target, was attributed to cloud drift, creating the illusion of acceleration. Yet the witness accounts regarding this second object were far stranger, especially in describing its rapid maneuvers in multiple directions. None of the observers believed it resembled a star, planet, balloon, or any known aircraft. Report of unusual phenomenon from the Lockbourne Tower by telegraph operator Albert Pickering. On Wednesday, January 7, 1948, at approximately 7:25 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, I observed an aerial object which I could not identify. It appeared to hover in one position for a considerable length of time, showing little or no movement. At one point, it vanished for about a minute, which I assumed was due to drifting behind a cloud layer at roughly 10,000 feet. When it re-emerged below the clouds, it circled in place 3 times, each revolution taking about 30 to 40 seconds, with an estimated diameter of 2 miles. It then shifted to another position and repeated the circling. During these maneuvers, it left a luminous trail about 5 times its own length. Because I could not judge distance, I found it difficult to estimate exact size, but it appeared at least as large as, if not larger than, one of our C-47 aircraft, and of a different shape, either round or oval. Just before it vanished, the object descended close to the ground, hovered for about 10 seconds, then climbed with extreme speed back to 10,000 feet, moved laterally, and disappeared into the clouds on a heading of 120 degrees. Its horizontal velocity was estimated at greater than 500 miles per hour. The object remained in view for roughly 20 minutes. It emitted no sound whatsoever. Its color was amber, though not so bright as to blur its nearly circular outline. While ascending or descending, its movements resembled those of an elevator, 2 straight vertical motion, not banking or circling. The trail was only visible during forward flight, resembling a thin vapor of the same amber hue, about 5 times the object's length. During descent, it appeared to touch, or nearly touch, the ground. I estimated its position at 3 to 5 miles from Lockbourne, in the vicinity of Commercial Point. I am certain it was not a star, comet, or any celestial body known to me. I also rule out the possibility of a balloon, flare, dirigible, or any military or civilian aircraft. I am 26 years of age, in good health, with excellent eyesight. I have been associated with aviation for 6 years, hold a private pilot's license, and served 3 years and 10 months in the United States Army Air Corps as a sergeant, instructing on the link trainer and supervising instrument flight. The above statements are true and accurate to the best of my knowledge and may be used for any official purpose. Report of unusual phenomenon from Lockbourne Air Operations Officer by Frank Issel. At approximately 7:40 p.m. on January 7th, the tower controller informed me he had been observing a strange light to the southwest for some time. When I stepped out onto the operations building platform, the light had disappeared. Less than 2 minutes later, as I returned inside, the tower again reported its reappearance. I stepped back out, and this time saw the object myself. It was about 15 degrees above the horizon, southwest by west of Lockbourne, giving off a deep red light that shifted to amber every 1 or 2 seconds. Its size and brilliance exceeded any star. To the eye, it resembled a fully lit runway lamp viewed from 500 feet away. Its shape appeared generally circular, except for a thin streak trailing toward the horizon, about 5 times the object's diameter. From the time I first observed it until about 7:50 p.m., it appeared to remain stationary. It then descended to the horizon in about 4 seconds, hovered there for 3 seconds, and climbed back to its original position in another 3 seconds. Its path traced an elliptical, counterclockwise arc. It then dimmed, descended, and vanished around 7:55 p.m. During the entire observation, it emitted no sound. To me, it appeared about 5 miles distant. However, I later learned that Clinton County Tower reported observing the same or a similar object at the same bearing and time. If it was indeed the same object, then its distance must have been far greater than 5 miles, and its speed well over 500 miles per hour. In fact, it appeared to move at that speed, as seen from Lockbourne. Airway Communications further reported that God-Man Field had also observed the phenomenon at the same time, noting its disappearance at 8:06 p.m. Clinton reported the object vanishing at about 8 o'clock sharp. I do not know which station first observed it. These reports were relayed by direct phone from Clinton and from Airway Communications at Patterson. The weather office confirmed heavy overcast with no celestial bodies visible, meaning the object was clearly beneath the clouds. Its erratic movements demonstrated that it could not have been an astronomical phenomenon. Air Force Aircraft Number 9944, a C-45, reported position to Lockbourne radio while flying over Columbus at 7:53 p.m. Altitude 5,000 feet, and on a round trip from Wright Field to Washington. I asked the pilot if he saw any unusual lights southwest of his position. He replied in the affirmative, describing a bright light off his right wing that resembled a giant beacon. I have been a member of the American Museum of Natural History, affiliated with the Hayden Planetarium in New York, for 6 years, and have long held an interest in astronomy. I served 37 months in the Army Air Forces in communications, including tower operations. I currently hold a valid tower operator's license in aeronautical communications and have served at Lockbourne for more than a year and a half. I am 25 years old, in good health and sound of mind. What I have reported is exactly what I saw with my own eyes and what I heard over the communications system. Report from Lockbourne Air Force Base by Captain Charles McGee. At approximately 7:25 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on January 7, 1948, I was entering downwind leg for runway 23 at 1,500 feet. Before breaking off the pattern, I noticed an unusually bright white light to the southwest of the base. I continued in a 360-degree pattern, and at that point realized the light was not on the ground but suspended in the air. When I lined up again for final approach, it remained visible, appearing to hang at roughly 3,000 feet. While still on approach, the light suddenly disappeared. It did not project a beam, and in size it resembled a large headlamp. As I continued inbound, the light flared once more and then extinguished. I landed immediately and taxied to parking, thinking perhaps it had been a ground reflection or some similar effect. Prior to my flight, I had overheard part of a radio transmission between Latterson Center and Olmsted Center concerning a circular object reported over Tennessee. I wondered whether this might have been the same thing Captain Mantell was pursuing, since he likely heard that information in the air. After landing, I returned to the operations building, where the air operations officer, Mr. Isel, informed me that the tower controller, Mr. Boudreau, had reported seeing an unusual light to the southwest. I confirmed that I had seen it as well and suggested we call the tower to verify. Through the interphone, Boudreau stated that he had been observing the object for about 15 minutes. Through binoculars, he described what looked like a bluish trail on the right, similar to a jet effect. He reported that the light vanished while I was still airborne. During our discussion, Boudreau said the object might reappear around 7:35 to 7:40 p.m. He then stepped outside to look from the ground. The light reappeared, moving farther west and lower than when I had observed it aloft. It flickered like a lantern, shifting from pale yellow to orange, seeming to sink gradually and then fade out. Later observation confirmed that while moving westward, the light dimmed and descended. On its second appearance, however, it was far less brilliant than before. The object was too large and too distinct to have been a ground reflection. Nor could it have been a celestial body, as the sky over Lockbourne was completely overcast. Its movements further ruled out such a possibility. No sound was heard at any time. During my first sighting, I estimated it about 45 miles southwest of the base. On the second, about 67 miles west, drifting slowly as though hovering and then receding. Winds at the time were from the southwest at roughly 6 miles per hour. Report of unusual phenomenon by Lockbourne Air Traffic Controller Alex Boudreau. On Wednesday, January 7th, between 7:15 and 7:30 p.m., I observed a brilliant, luminous object in the sky which I could not identify. At first, I thought it might be a star, but with the sky entirely overcast, I was certain it was not. It was not an aircraft either, since the only plane in the area was in the landing pattern. It was far too large to be a flare or balloon. Through binoculars, the object appeared conical, broad at the top, tapering downward. I could not fix its altitude precisely. Its color shifted from bright white to amber, with a faint trail extending behind it. The object was about 5 to 7 miles from the tower, estimated at 2,000 to 3,000 feet in altitude, oscillating up and down while moving southwest at a speed exceeding 500 miles per hour. Winds were blowing east to west at the time. If it had been a balloon or lighter than aircraft, it would have drifted with the wind, not against it. There was no accompanying sound. Its performance was highly unusual. At times the light dimmed, then grew vivid again. Just before vanishing below the horizon, it glowed deep red. A similar object was later reported by tower personnel at Clinton County Airfield. I have worked in aviation for 5 years as an air traffic controller and private pilot. In that time, I have never suffered optical illusions or impairments that would compromise my professional judgment. As those at Lockbourne have already stated, after first appearing within about 5 miles of the base between 7:10 and 7:50 p.m., the same luminous object, or one exactly like it, was next reported some 60 to 70 miles southwest, hovering in the sky and performing further unusual maneuvers. This time it was observed about 15 to 20 miles southwest of Clinton County Air Base. If not coincidence, then Clinton County, AFN, today known as Wilmington Air Park, FN, was notably the site where a top-secret Skyhook weather balloon was reportedly released earlier that very day. Once again, Air Force investigators suggested that this balloon could have been the mystery object, drifting more than 200 miles southwest until Captain Mantell spotted it and pursued to altitudes that caused hypoxia and loss of consciousness, leading to his fatal crash. Still, the geometry is perplexing. When first sighted southwest of Lockbourne, and Lockbourne itself lies northeast of Clinton County, the object, when seen again from Clinton, was not to the northeast. Instead, observers there still reported it southwest of their position, 15 to 20 miles away. Even more puzzling, personnel at Lockbourne insisted that Clinton County staff were observing the same object at the same time. Yet from Lockbourne, it was estimated only 45 miles distant. Both could not be true simultaneously. This coincidence adds another curious detail. When an object was sighted over Godman Field in Kentucky at about 2 o'clock that afternoon, then first reported at Lockbourne around 7 p.m., and then again near Clinton County close to 8 o'clock, all were consistently located southwest of the base from which they were observed. Given that the objects either hovered or executed abrupt vertical and lateral maneuvers, the simplest explanation may be that all these personnel were witnessing the same phenomenon from different vantage points at different times. The official Air Force line remained that they had simply seen Venus, yet with the sky completely overcast, and given the reported erratic movements, such a conclusion was, and remains, highly doubtful. Report of Unusual Aerial Phenomenon from Clinton County Air Base by James H. Hudson. I, James H. Hudson, was on duty in the tower when the object was first reported by operations personnel. They asked if it could be a flare. We immediately turned binoculars on it. At first sight, the object appeared white, then turned red. Only one object was observed. Its actual shape could not be determined until it descended. At that point it looked conical, or like an inverted triangle, see Figure A. The sketches appended to this report were drawn by Corporal Hudson. When ascending, it returned to a vertical orientation, Figure B. As for size, I could not estimate precisely, but it appeared larger than any star. During ascent and descent, it seemed to trail a bluish haze, Figure C. Its speed could not be measured in miles per hour because it sometimes remained stationary, yet when moving, it accelerated abruptly. Its maneuvers as seen from the tower are outlined in Figure D. It then moved southwest at high speed and vanished at approximately 7:55 p.m. The estimated distance at first sighting was 15 to 20 miles. No sound was heard. The luminous trail may have been exhaust of some kind, bluish in color. Through binoculars-coated optics, which may slightly alter hues, I noted that even when a cloud drifted in front, the light still shone through, similar to how a lamp glows behind dark cloth. Although I found no other reports of rapid maneuvers aside from that of Mr. Frank Isel at Lockbourne, GO, and despite the fact that a strange object was also reported near Godman Field earlier in the day, it is curious that this detail never appeared in the final summary of what Captain Mantell may have been chasing before his death. That's all for today. The next video will be coming soon, so don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a comment. Thank you for watching. 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 Thank you for